Hello and welcome to Talking About My Generation. I'm Herb Ricardo with Rich Grego and Alicia Vassar. And today we're going to talk about young men. We're also going to, when we talk about young men, we're going to talk about men, and we're also going to talk about women. We're going to talk a little bit about Scott Galloway, who's a professor at NYU, marketing professor, and of course most people know about him. He's had the number. I think he currently has four podcasts going on right now.
Mm.
He's written a couple of books, and he's a self-made executive, and he's made a lot of money buying and selling companies. But
Mm.
his big push over the last couple of years, at least the last 5 years even, has been this idea that young men are being left behind. And I can clearly resonate with that in the sense of I've got students, I've got young students, and part of my job is to help young individuals, both male and female, succeed and try to figure out life at a young as much as they can at such a young age. But obviously, his idea really is that it's almost in crisis, that young men are in crisis, that they're on a path to not earn and feel the emotional and cultural care that society has to offer. And I don't have a better group of individuals in front of me to talk about Scott Galloway's ideas than Alisha Vassar, our terrific Gen Z young lady who is going to really give us some pretty good insight into this generation. Again, being that expert right there. And of course, our philosophical guru, Rich Grego, who clearly understands because he and I have been talking about this for well over 2 decades with our students and everything else. And so I think everyone's really going to enjoy what we have to cover. So without further ado, I'm going to open it up to Alicia. And Alicia, what do you think?
So this was my first time being introduced to Scott Galloway, and one of the things that kind of hit me most is that focus on young men being left behind. I think it expands. I think that's just younger people in general. Um, One of the first things that he talks about is the fact that there's like this divestment in the future of younger people. Um, he talks about how the way that our economy works, the way that things have been uh, going on, it's consolidating wealth into older people. And there's divestment in the education, social safety nets, education, all things of younger people, our future. And I think he was really great at kind of showing how that is really leading the way young people are moving um, around and how they're reacting, um, which was interesting because, like I said, you or David, not David Brooks, Scott Galloway's focus is on men, but I thought it was very interesting that as a young person and as a woman, I feel very similar to what he was bringing up.
Yeah, Rich?
Yeah. Well, I was wondering if maybe a good way to introduce this thing is to sort of maybe Herb, you'd be in a better position to sort of sum up really briefly, like what his central message. I guess you kind of did, but also in terms of some of the numbers, right? If you have them at your disposal, I should have written them down, but I mean, I think those are where he usually starts, right? Scott Galloway when he's talking. Incidentally, Jonathan Haidt was also in this. We're referring in this. I just for our viewers, we're referring to a an interview between Scott Galloway, who Herb introduced, as well as Jonathan Haidt, who and then a third guy, really, I'm not that familiar with. I bet you are, Herb. But the Jonathan Haidt is a very important public intellectual. He's a social psychologist. Not I don't even know if he's affiliated with an institution anymore. But because he's sort of he sort of goes around the world lecturing and consulting and stuff like that. But his specialty is moral psychology, and he, as well as Scott Galloway and this other guy, what's his name, guys?
To David
Sarah.
Brooks?
No, not David
David
Brooks.
Brooks.
The third one in the interview. Oh my God. Reese. Richard Reese.
Uh,
Gosh, I don't know.
we've got him over here. It's yeah, Richard Reeves.
Richard Reese, yeah, and I'm not that familiar with his stuff, but he's another public intellectual focusing on many of the same sort of social indicators that these guys are. And again, the numbers that they posit, and again, they always begin with empirical research. The numbers that they posit in terms of empirical statistics regarding trends among not only younger Americans, but Americans at large, the population at large, in terms of a lot of not just socioeconomic conditions, but also psychosocial health that to me are even more important in a sense and more alarming in a sense than the socioeconomic issues that we hear about every day. You hear about these on the news, and politicians bloviate about them incessantly because they're important. But I think they're also somewhat secondary in my opinion, of secondary importance to these psychosocial trends that they were talking about and that they're concerned about. And Jonathan Haidt just wrote a best-selling book entitled The Anxious Generation, I believe,
That's right.
about your generation, Alisha, and younger, that that addresses some of these psychosocial trends. There's a whole spate of books on the topic of psychosocial trends among younger people, specifically with regard to the effects of social media and AI, beginning way back in the 90s and the early 2000s with Sherry Turkle's book called Alone Together, which I still advise reading. It came out around 2010 or 11. Very good book, very important, because what shocked her was she had been studying this phenomenon among younger people for well over a decade, and came up and had completely different negative findings than she thought she was going to get. And then another book by I forget her first name. Her last name is Tweeg, called iGen, both of which came out around the first decade of the 2000s. And in a very real sense, Jonathan Haidt's recent book, it's a bestseller, called The Anxious Generation, is an update on those trends that, in his opinion, are even more alarming than the prior trends from these other books and these other studies. And there are things like, again, and correct, again, jump in if I'm missing anything, but they're measuring things like incidence of mental illness, depression, drug addiction, but even more, in my opinion, subtle stuff like how many close friends do you have? How much participation do you have outside of your home in any aspect of life? How much time do you spend on a screen every day? How often, or if ever, have you asked, and this is with men, have you asked a girl out on a date? Very telling trends that to me really get to the essence of what they are worried about as far as psychosocial effects of whatever's going on in modernity, and they have some interesting reasons for why this is happening. So anyway, just in terms of background, I wanted to give the listeners what we're talking about here before we jump into the conversation.
Absolutely. And kind of going along with that, what Jonathan Haidt does in his book, The Anxious Generation, what he does is he takes that information of 20, 25 years ago, and he includes really the social media and the technology characteristic, which he talks about hijacks the mind. And that's where he really puts this idea that the looking at a screen constantly is what's causing this anxiety. The other thing too, and that's where you've got Jonathan and Scott coming together and talking about young men, and that is they're spending more time on technology. Um, and now this is where I kind of come in a little bit, and this is where I've been talking a little bit with Rich, you and I have been chatting about for the last 20 years. And I noticed this phenomenon many, many years ago, and that is I noticed where with females, with girls, mothers were talking to girls and saying, you can be whatever you want, you can do whatever, it used to be a man's world, but it's not anymore. But you're going to have to work hard, you're going to have to prove yourself, you have to go to college, university, and so on and so forth. But you can go into anything. You can go into mathematics, you can go into engineering, you can go into construction, you can go into those male-dominated environments. And of course, we already know that they're in healthcare, and other environments such as that. And then the boys, a lot of the fathers and men were doing, let's do man stuff, which is let's go out, let's go fishing, let's play football, sports, gambling, and everything else like that. And there is no doubt that this has been that shift, and where it's not cool to be a nerd. It's not cool to read a book. It's not cool to be spending time at home doing these things. And then the other thing too is who's teaching men or young men how to be men. This is Scott Galloway in the sense of responsibility, how to approach a girl. And recognize that, when you approach somebody whom you don't know whether or not they're going to accept you or not. They're going, you're going to ask them for a date. They might say no and reject you. What do you do with that rejection? What does that rejection do to you? Yes, it hurts you, but then how long is it going to hurt you for? It could hurt you for a couple of days, a couple of weeks, a couple of months. David Brooks talks, it could be even a couple of years, right? The point though is we have to go through life and we have to experience those things. And a couple of things that Scott Galloway talks about is that because young men are not been educated, trained, learned in that environment, they don't want to feel it. And when they do feel it, their first inclination either is to uh, uh, go into the environment where they feel more comfortable, which is playing video games, staying at home, hanging out with other guy friends, and not doing that. And with the statistics, which are incredible, young men between 0 and 30 have not had a girlfriend, something like 40%. I mean, just incredible
Yeah,
numbers.
yeah,
They haven't kissed a girl. He even talks about 30, to 35 years old, 25% haven't had sex. And again, it's not that he's trying to push that, but again, these are all feelings that influence our emotions and how we navigate the world.
right.
That's the point. The point is the relationship you have with others, and especially the emotional connection that you have with the other sex, helps you. It kind of grounds you somewhat into feeling elated and despondent, happy, sad, all those things, and then having to understand how to navigate that. Whereas if you don't and you get older, then it becomes more difficult for you. And then it also becomes more difficult for you to navigate the workspace and the other social environments, right? And those are the things that he talks about.
Yeah.
Oh, you know.
And not just because I want to hear what Alicia, I really want to hear what Alicia has to say about all this stuff. But one of the other things he notes is not just the emphasis isn't just on romantic relationships, which are lacking, but just having a close friend. And this goes, and actually this is goes across the age spectrum and social spectrum of people participating in life less with other people, which is, as we know, right? That's how you learn in a sense to navigate the workspace and other relationships. You practice right through life, beginning when you're when you're a kid, doing that. So that's the only thing I wanted to add. But I was wondering yeah, Alicia, what do you think about all this stuff? I had a couple of questions for you specifically too.
So one of the things that I thought was interesting is like you guys were talking about, like they continuously talk about this change around like 2013-ish, where access to smartphones and social media just became very normalized. Which is interesting perspective because at that point, like I had already had a phone by time I was 8 or 9. It was just like
Mhm.
a little flip phone or something. But seeing how much, I guess, the quick change, like that's 2013.
Yeah.
That's not that long
Yeah.
ago.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Um, but I think there's also this thing of what Scott Galloway's talking about is when there's this friction that men are facing, technology is this alternative that is frictionless.
Yes.
You can, it doesn't give you that connection. Like we were talking about those statistics. I think one of the things that Scott Galloway or David Brooks, one of them said was imagine all of the times as you were a child laughing and having fun with friends. Imagine if you never had that.
Yeah.
And that
That's
was a
great. That was
very
excellent.
profound,
Yes.
that was
Yeah.
very profound because
Yeah.
that is very much, especially accelerated post dealing with the pandemic and how we had to isolate and it changed a lot of different things. There is, especially because I've watched a movie recently. Good Luck, Don't Die, Have Fun. It
Yeah.
was just a random movie that me and David ended up deciding to pick. And we watched the trailer and we were just instantly engaged with it because this guy comes into like a diner and he basically says he's from the future and they have to save the world. And this technology, basically phones, like he starts chucking phones into like water and stuff. He's like, this is going to be the death of you.
Mhm.
Um, but the entire kind of like guess theme of the movie was technology and the way that it breaks us apart, disconnects us. There's this one scene in particular where this guy gets introduced to like this VR world, and he's already has a relationship with a woman, and he's thinking of having a family. All of these things that we traditionally see as the goals that people would search for, that would aim for, but he gives all of it up once he gets access to this VR world where he can basically be in there, engage, and not have to deal with any of the friction of reality. So much so that he makes a decision. There's a scene where he's literally breaking up with his girlfriend and, like, yeah, I'm going to sell all of my stuff and I'm going to go live in a VR world. And he's like, I'm sorry, but I have to. Like, it the way that it sounds, it's like someone who is highly addicted to a substance, the way
Mhm.
that he reacted to it. I thought that was like one of the most surreal scenes. And listening to Scott Galloway and the way that or the podcast that we've been talking about in general, and how technology has definitely placed this barrier, especially because from one perspective, I do see this great access to information and connection. And like when I was talking with David, the reason we were able to meet is through social or internet, through technology.
Yep.
So holding that in one hand with also the real reality that
Yeah.
it could be disconnecting us from people.
Yeah. Yeah, isn't that that's the paradox, right? That's the ethical moral dilemma paradox, isn't it? And interestingly, I don't know if this is an aside or not. That was a fascinating movie. I'm going to check it out if you think it's worth it, Alicia.
It's very funny, very
Is it?
strange,
Yeah.
but it definitely makes you ask a lot of questions.
Yeah, yeah, it sounds that way. And there's this old thought experiment in philosophy. And I may have brought it up in other because it's so relevant to so many of the things we talked about, called the happiness box experiment with a famous philosopher, Thomas Nagel, put forth this thought experiment to prove to people that, because a lot of people have this notion, especially in our world today and this age of narcissism, that basically what motivates people is selfishness and personal pleasure, and they put that above, and they place that above all else in their lives. As a matter of fact, some people make a lifestyle out of that, or at least espouse to, aspire to that lifestyle, or so they say. And how the thought experiment goes is, he said, imagine you can place yourself in a box. And basically, this thought experiment's from like the 60s or something, but he's describing a VR reality. Basically, if you could put yourself in a Matrix VR kind of reality, where you're again, you're in a world that's just like ours, but it gives you everything you want. Basically, you can do everything you want to do there, and have one pleasurable, happy experience after another, and it'll give you whatever you want. And heighten your experiences if you want them, if you want more of them, or change them, or anything like that. But the price you have to pay is, again, what you have to do. It'll recreate everything that you'd experience in what we call the real world, only it won't be real. It'll be an illusion that this computer is generating for your mind, that you're living in, and all the experiences you think you're having, like genuine love and genuine interaction with other people and genuine challenges and adventures you'd have to face in life. You're not, in a sense, not really doing them. They're in this computer simulation that's set up to always make you happy. And how many, so then he asks, how many people would actually choose to do that? And again, back then, and maybe even now, I bet now even, most people say, well, of course. I mean, it's great to have pleasurable experiences, but if they're an illusion, I'd rather have the real thing. I don't want fake love and fake friends and fake accomplishments. I want real ones. That movie and what you were proposing, Alisha, makes me wonder whether we could be so conditioned, and maybe we're getting so conditioned, that most people are increasingly willing to choose a happiness box kind of life over a real life. And if if the trajectory keeps on going and the technologies keep improving, will it not someday be the case that most people would rather do that? I don't know. Is there something inherent about the human condition that revolts against that, or can we be conditioned to want to live in a computer simulation, which we are?
I think that there's also the socioeconomic kind of environment that affects that. Obviously, most people want the real thing. They want the actual genuine thing.
Yeah.
But that's not what we have access to.
Mm.
So the idea is, I guess, if we, especially going back to that feeling of a divestment in our future, if you don't see a future, then it's just those instant dopamine hits. I thought it was interesting that in the podcast they talked about gambling and how much of a problem it has become. I've been hearing article after article, insider trading happening in sports betting, how prolific. I think it was like half of young men are sports betting. That is insane.
Amazing. I know.
Especially because I believe this has only been like allowed, or like it's only been allowed relatively recently. And it's only
frankly,
just
I didn't know it was myself.
Yeah. Most betting is it's very restricted, and it's casinos and things, they have a lot of restrictions. And I knew it was very similar with sports betting, and it's become easier and easier accessible. And it's like, I feel like in a sense we're set up for failure. Because we don't see that future. You're and this is male or female, you're just going to grasp onto what is there now. And I think it was really interesting listening to the podcast, because it talks about how men are often praised for risk taking, but also due to their brain not being as fully developed until a later age, prefrontal cortex and all of these different things. That's funny. I lost where I was going while talking about a prefrontal cortex.
Well, no, that would feed into what you're talking about, because that's what technologies are taking advantage of. They're
but I think there's also that socioeconomic thing of, when you don't see a future, you're going to choose that box because you might as well be happy now.
My only response to that, and I wish I had the actual data in front of me so I could quote numbers, but I do not think that during times, whether it was economic panics of the past couple of 100 years or the Great Depression, where you can imagine what people's socioeconomic expectations were then growing up in the Depression, that you had the same that you had phenomenon like alcoholism increasing or anything.
Yes.
Whereas you do now. So what that's what's sort of saying to me is that maybe the crisis isn't so much socioeconomically grounded as we think, that it's more of a spiritual response, that it's easy to blame on. So that certainly socioeconomic opportunities and lack thereof don't help the perception of a lack of a socioeconomic prosperous future. But I just don't know if I think that, again, and this is one of the things they brought up, the left tends to focus. Am I wrong, Herb? The left tends to focus on socioeconomic opportunities as the cause for all of our evils, whereas traditionally the right, maybe because of the religious right, has tended to focus on our spiritual, moral sort of fiber as being more responsible for the psychological issues that are bad psychological trends that are taking place over the last couple of decades. And I think that they are both, and this is one thing I think David Brooks kind of focuses on. Am I wrong, Herb? That this is really more than just a response to a socioeconomic crisis. It's a spiritual crisis that runs deeper. At least that's my sense. Go ahead. I'm talking too much. What do you think, Herb? Do you
No,
agree?
this is excellent. David Brooks talked about the time that he went into Denver and it was 5:30 in the evening and he goes to church and he finds the congregation, the church is full of men, young men.
Yeah.
And obviously they're seeking this, right? So there's no doubt. I think we've got a bit of a perfect storm here because everything that you're talking about, everything that Alisha brought up, talking about technology, talking about not being able to get ahead, that there's this disconnect with the community. All these things, uh, you take a young individual and Alisha also talked about the fact that I think women, young girls, also are falling into this to some degree, but I think there's a greater level of optimism.
I think they
Um,
handle it better. Yes.
they handle it better. They mature quicker
Yes. Yep. Yep.
than men, and so they're able to
Yep.
handle some of the problems a
Yeah.
lot easier than men do. But again, I think it's kind of it's almost like a game of whack-a-mole as far as I see it, and that is all these areas of what you as a young man have been either taught or in the sense of life is going to get better as you get older, right? This is what you think as a child. You say, I want to become an adult. I want to have freedom. I want to be able to do the things that I want to do. And I think what happens is, I think what's going on right now, and whether it's kind of going back to what you're saying, Rich, whether or not it's real or not, the point is it's projected as real, and it's projected as real because we've got social media, and that is it's hard to find a good job.
Yeah.
How long do you stay in a particular job until you find that there's no room for advancement, and now
Yeah.
you've got to move to another job. You get all this information about going to college or university that it's not worth it. Well, the statistics have been coming out that college students, when in college and university, um, when asked, do you believe that what you're doing is of value to you? 63% say, yes, we do. And then once they graduate, they're asked whether or not they believe that the college or university prepared them for a job. They go, yes, we do. And
Mm,
so there's a true disconnect in the
mm,
sense of what people are watching out there on social media that is trying to get the most clicks and
yeah.
hits.
Yeah.
And that is that kind of like that negative environment. We're hearing it now with AI. AI is going to take away all the jobs and everything else. And so now it's hard to get a job. You're not going to get paid enough. AI is going to come for you. Well, you keep hearing that enough in your economic environment, well, then you say, well, then what do I do? I don't know what to do.
Yeah, yeah,
Sure, they're going to say, well, you know what? Become an air conditioning person, become some other form of labor, become a car mechanic or whatever, which again are great jobs in the sense, but not everybody's cut out for that. The idea is we created a society that you could kind of pick and choose what area of work you wanted to be in. And then when we kind of go back to this whole idea of the emotional connection, you've got mothers teaching women, hey, you need to find an individual, a male, okay, who's responsible. You need to find a male who is going to care to your needs, who's going to go ahead and create stability in a home environment. Well, let me tell you something. At 20 years old, in a way, you're not thinking that way. You're not thinking that way. At 25 years old, you may not. Now, you start to think that way as you get through your 20s and into your 30s. Obviously, you're looking for a mate and everything else. But the point though is now we go on social media and we've got these characteristics of what, let's say, the male believes that the female ought to be. So now the female is finding, well, you know what? There aren't these young men who are going to satisfy my needs. So now I'm going to go up to a higher level. Now I'm going to look for a 30 or 40-year-old. This is a 20-year-old, 25-year-old female, not necessarily looking for another 25-year-old or 30-year-old male, right? And so it leaves these young men with their idea of whom they want. And what's left, if you want to use, I'm being very crude here, obviously, is that no, well, I don't like the way these particular girls look, or I don't like the way that they behave, or whatever. Well, if you didn't have social media and you didn't have this in your face, then women and men wouldn't have so much of this. I'm not saying that in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s that younger women were looking for more accomplished males. They clearly were, right? But it wasn't in your face like it is today. And that's the problem. The problem is where are we today?
yeah. One of the things I wanted to ask Alicia too in that regard is, they talked a lot about, and again, this is where to some extent, I want to say they laid the problem at the feet of contemporary women, because I think they think there are reasons for why women, in terms of their changing attitudes, have these attitudes, and that a lot of that has to do with men. But the attitude, according, and I can sort of, I mean, you can get anecdotal about this, but I guess statistically, the statistics bear this out, that younger women now are not as interested in, again, the old ritual of courtship was that, men are young and they're like, young lions. They want to go around and roam and find and mate with different women and stuff like that. And women are, men are the hunter-gatherers and women are the nest builders, right? They want to find somebody, they want to have a household and find a husband who's reliable. And women are ready to settle down and looking when they get into relationships to find somebody that they want to settle down with. And traditionally, they're the ones who have to civilize the men to that, in that regard, because the men have to get convinced to settle down. They realize they have to, but it's the women who want to settle down first. So now, though, women are not looking for that, are looking for that less and less. Statistically speaking, they just don't talk about relying on a man to make a household with. They don't rely on men to have children with. They can go that alone, and they're capable of doing it now. Mitch maybe has a lot more. They can decide more freely whether they even want to have children. They can have an active romantic life without having to worry about a household and children and consequences. And as a result, anyway, they're much more interested in career than they used to be, right? Women used to go to college in the 50s and 60s, the ones that did, to look for a husband. Obviously, to say that now to a woman, you'd be insulting, right? And no woman is going to say that now, even if they are, which most of them aren't, apparently. So I guess the upshot of this is that women have changed their expectations as far as relationships go. And partly because of that, men are starting to abandon their traditional roles as men, because women aren't looking for that. And women used to be the ones to make them interested in doing that. Again, this may not have been just, it may not have been, it may have invited a lot of the sexism and everything that we've taken several decades or more to overcome. But that's one of the things that made men men back in the day, as well as mentorship, as well as grown men who act like men instead of children, which is another issue that I think a lot of social psychologists, as well as historians who've studied these trends, have pointed out. That we've begun to celebrate men who don't act like traditional men anymore. We celebrate the perpetual adolescent male now a lot in our social media, in our popular culture, in our movies, and TV shows, things like that. So that all of these things have contributed to men not acting like men. And I started this spiel by saying I wanted to hear what you had to say, Alisha. I'm sorry, but I just was wondering what do you think about all that? And is that the kind of thing that you see?
So I thought it was interesting that Scott Galloway brought up that, like, very early on in the first podcast that you guys shared with me, this dichotomy of men versus women, and that
Yeah,
the success of women is at the expense of men. It's like a right wing kind of framework.
yeah, yeah,
Um, but I think a lot of times Galloway falls into it himself.
yeah.
He talks about how the education system is biased towards women, but the reality is education didn't become a female field until like the 70s or 80s because women weren't allowed into that field. Um,
Higher education, right?
well,
I mean, I had very
yes,
few male teachers when I was in public schools. I don't know about you guys. They were mainly women. Well, I knew
but
you're a new generation, but way back in the ancient
there's
days.
also the way that societally we treat jobs that are considered more feminine. They're
Yeah,
less paid.
yeah, yeah,
You're working harder. You're not getting as much. Um, so
yeah.
that also kind of contributes towards this continual.
Mm,
Women and minorities tend to get jobs that are hard and don't pay as well.
yeah.
Um, but I back to the like Scott Galloway. I think he falls into that dichotomy. Both of us are
Mhm,
being screwed over by this system.
mhm,
Um, and I think that kind of reaction of women kind of, as they've gotten more access to the resources that they've needed because they have been heavily relied on, a lot of times there's this sense that you do not need a man. And I
yeah.
very much understand that scene from the perspective of my mother, who she's very traditional in the sense of she got pregnant with me quite young. She got married with my father, and they had their relationship. Um, Now, as an adult, they're separated.
Mm,
And there is a lot that my mother has spoken about of dealing with being in a relationship where it feels disproportionate, where a lot of the caretaking, and especially when you're talking about the socioeconomic, women are getting access to more uh, better jobs and education and all of these things. So it ends up leading down this path where it feels like there's no sense of why am I going to take care of a child and on top of it a grown child, because I
mhm,
don't think that we idealize or we idealize this infantilized perpetual child. I
mhm,
don't think that that is specific to our time or anything. I
mhm,
think that has always been the way that this binary of male and female
mhm,
has always been seen. This dumbing down of the idea that men don't have access to emotional intelligence, that we're not within a system that does not promote those things for men, that we don't tell them uh, that we perpetuate these ideas that they shouldn't get access to mental health because they have to be strong and stoic. And this is kind of going into a segue. But when we were talking about like what men are genuinely looking for in their, uh, I guess, representation of of masculinity. And when I was talking with David, I found it was very interesting that he kind of created his own form of positive masculinity,
I
um,
noticed that.
that
Yeah.
went against that, you know, open to emotions, is caring,
Mhm.
caring for family and friends, a realist, down to earth, having emotional control and things. So I do think that there is not just that, I think it's evolving the way that we are seeing masculinity. And I think that helps in a lot of ways.
Just a quick comment. I noticed the way you described David. He sound his the comments that you conveyed that he had made sound to me a lot like what Galloway is lamenting are absent from men now, that are pretty what he thought were traditional attributes, that traditional roles men had to play involved. So that's just one thing I noticed about that. And that may have to do with the fact that that's what he is. He's playing a role in your relationship that's more like what a traditional man is supposed to be, which is why it's a successful relationship. I don't know.
I think that contributes a lot to it. Um, but I think also it kind of shows, crap, I lost where I was going with that. You guys can
Yeah.
take it back.
Fine.
You know, I think it's really interesting to hear. I just love this. Thank you so much. Thanks for making my life rich, the two of you. I mean, it really truly does. But you know what? When I hear about some of these things, you know, Rich, you help me out. Growing up, we weren't being told, in a sense, how to be a man. We weren't.
A little bit, but yeah,
Well, when I
I know
say
what you
that.
mean.
When I say
Yeah.
that, we were told to be responsible.
Yeah.
We were being corrected when we did something wrong. And again, maybe I missed out on that because my mother was divorced.
Mm.
I had three stepfathers, and they were all away. Oh, I had two stepfathers. I had fathers, and they were never in the home. But a lot of the men in my life were my friends' fathers, and they took me up under their wing,
Mm.
and I learned about being a man through.
Yeah.
And each one of them, I can tell you, Bob Herring, Alan Russ, Raymond Ritchie's, these men were great husbands, great fathers. They worked hard. They weren't always even at home, but they worked hard because they had to bring in, right? So you learned what that was, and they treated their wives wonderfully. They weren't out there having other girlfriends on the side or anything else. They just didn't have the time, and they wanted to be at home. They wanted to be with their family.
Yeah. Yeah,
And
I
I agree. Lee, it was kind of a mentorship through example, I
yeah,
guess.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And I think the thing is, you know, when I think about today, I just think that the men today are not. I mean, even if you're not married, I'm not married. You can still convey to younger men what you need to do, being responsible, being on time, making comments. Now, I'll even go a little bit off, right, a little bit, off the beaten path on here and say, the workplace and the Me Too movement, hey, I understand why it came about. I truly do. I don't think there's any reason to uh, be offensive towards women or towards anybody in the workplace. I don't believe in harassment. I don't believe in any other than, as you all know, creating a work environment that is pleasurable, and it's one where ultimately people want to come to work, they want to be around individuals. But the other thing too is what we've done is we've created a great level of stoicism in the workplace, and that is don't bring your emotions in there, so
Mhm.
that you don't have a boss. You don't have, and that's the other thing too, is not only did these men when I was younger, but then I had bosses who were mentors towards me and telling me how to behave, how to work. within that. So it was I was constantly getting it. Whereas now you stay away from that. As a man, you don't tell a woman or another man how to behave. All you do is focus on work. You
Mhm.
start talking about things that are other than work, then you're going to get called into human resources because all we're doing is we're just focusing on work. We're not talking, we're not getting into emotions. Whereas in the workplace, we did talk about emotions. We
Yeah.
talked about feelings. We talked about what do you think and how are you feeling and everything else because we knew that that's how you're going to end up what communicating
But
with.
that I feel like that's a false equivalency because when we're talking about things like the Me Too movement and sexual harassment at work, people aren't talking about being emotional and talking and being honest. We're talking about feeling like a sexual object and like your body is expected to be on the line um, for uh, quid pro quo and all of these things. Um, I understand that definitely it's probably caused a level of hesitancy to engage in a romantic way, and I can understand that frustration. But considering the Me Too movement was about a lot of women, like hearing stories of women being told to come into offices and being shown the genitals of
Mhm.
people who are their boss. And they have to figure out how to deal with that. They have to figure out how to deal with being in the industry after that, whether or not they want to continue to take this. Um, so it does get
Yeah.
a little frustrating when it feels like it's minimizing the real danger. And this is what I get frustrated with Scott Galloway because it felt like he was minimizing the
Mhm.
very real danger that women face when they are dealing with when they engage with men.
Yeah.
Yes, that danger. I know he makes this false equivalency that a man's more likely to kill themselves than you, but
Yeah.
how does that have to deal with the woman in this
And that was
situation?
always some of those statistics too. They were kind of always the case. I mean, that's not it, men always committed more violent crimes. Men, oh, except men, they always killed themselves more often than women. They still do. I mean, that's been a
But
statistic
that's
since the
also
beginning
a
of time. It's
byproduct
not a
of being within a patriarchal system that tells you those emotions, the same things that we were talking about that should be
yeah.
involved in
Mm,
work,
mm,
um, are traditionally not seen as things that men should engage with. It's the stoicism, it's the
yeah.
independence.
Yeah. I
And
agree. Yeah,
this
I
is
get what
why
you're saying.
talking with David and stuff, and I like the idea of like we have more in common than we have in different. We're both suffering under this system.
Yeah.
So it definitely feels like it doesn't have to be a zero sum game.
Yeah, and that's I think I don't want to put words in Herb's mouth, respond Herb to me, but I think that's kind of what Herb was saying. The Me Too movement, although absolutely essential, the concern with sexual harassment and women's treating women equally in the workplace and with dignity and everything, all the dignity you accord any human being it's a very important concern because it was an injustice perpetrated against women for since time immemorial, and we needed to correct that. But I'm and what Herb and maybe Scott Galloway too, I think, and Jonathan Haidt, although they maybe weren't expressing it delicately enough, is that what I think Herb is concerned about is that in the effort to accomplish these positive goals that you're talking about, Alisha, we have also excised humanity too much from the workplace. But again, you don't want sexual harassment in the workplace, but given the fact that I don't know what it is, like 80% of, I'm just throwing out the statistic, but like a huge vast majority of people meet their mates in the workplace and their best friends in the workplace to excise that from the workplace is contributing to just these issues that am I articulating where you're coming from,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
That they're concerned about, and that I agree with as well, with
sure.
what
And
you're saying.
and everything that Alicia is saying is absolutely true. And I do not want to, as you mentioned, Alicia, I don't want to minimize in any way, shape, or form.
Yeah.
The other thing too, though, is you've got to understand, think of your age. and think of where you are and think of my age and think of where I am. And that is, I've been in the workplace for 40 years, okay? And in 40 years, I did not see much of that at all. Okay. And this is part of, there's no doubt there are some industries and some areas, okay, of the workplace where that's more prevalent than in others. I'll actually go out there on a limb and say, sure, it was probably going on, but not to the degree, not to the degree. If you take teachers, if you take nurses, sure, you start going into corporate America. Even in the corporation, I didn't see a whole lot of that. And I was an administrator. I mean, we truly made sure how we treated our employees, and it wasn't just me. It was the same level as me. People in my role or whatever. Now, again, when you start looking at the entertainment industry and you start looking at executives who have umpteen amounts of power and they're making millions and millions of dollars, there is no doubt. But I think you'll find if you really look at the average work environment over the last 30 years, you really didn't get too much of that. I'm not saying you didn't get any of it. That's not what I'm saying. There was probably some of that happening. But I think because I watched that, again, being an HR director, being a director of human resources in a
Mhm.
hospital setting
Mhm.
where you had men who were the directors, and then you had females who may have been the nurses or the technicians, and doctors being men. I had to watch how the doctors were treating the nurses. And yes, before that, in the 60s and the 70s, there was more of the manosphere, right? The doctor telling the nurses this is the way it's going to be and everything else. But of course, by the time I came in, the doctors all listened to the nurses and knew that they had to rely on them and they had to treat them better. And then kind of going back to what Rich was saying, again, back to what I'm trying to convey, and that is in the workplace too. The workplace should mimic the social environment on the outside. So where you are in the community with your friends and your family and everything else, to a certain degree, the workplace is a social environment too. Again, that doesn't mean that you have the right to be as offensive as you want. Absolutely not. It's a professional environment. It's a place where you need to treat people with respect. People need to be there because they're earning a living. But there's no doubt that if you work in a restaurant that's open till 2 o'clock in the morning, okay, and it's young people, and you work in an accounting company that's 9 to 5, and there's a higher level of professionalism, you're going to have a difference of behavior. And you're right, you still should have that level of professionalism. But I don't want to take anything away from what you're saying. And truly, whether or not it's a female or it's someone from a different culture, we should have, as a matter of fact, we should embrace more so than anything else people's differences and their creativity and what they bring to the workplace. Sure, I think that's been a little bit slower than we've cared for that to be. But I'm not discount that at all on what you're saying.
But going back to like the socioeconomic environment, I feel like a lot of times what you're talking about, that kind of community that you want to create, that connection that you want to create in workplaces, I feel like that's less and less possible because of the socioeconomic situation that most people are in. Companies are batting down and trying to sell as much stuff as they can. We talk a lot about how the same, I guess, stability that jobs provided before for older generations is not there for younger people.
I, I definitely
And I
agree.
think that
Yeah.
that contributes to not being able to have that connection. And I also think it drives people towards that technology, that frictionlessness,
Mhm.
um, over just dealing with the reality of the situation.
Alicia, I love where you went with that. I completely agree. I think if you're an individual and you're concerned about whether or not you're going to have that job tomorrow, that how you behave, you might be more submissive in that workspace. I completely agree. Than the people who are running the organization who know that they feel comfortable and confident that they're going to have a job. They have plenty of money. They might be older. I like where you're going with that. That is true. And we need to remove that. We need to create an environment where people feel comfortable, employees feel good about working in the environment, and they're not concerned, scared, or anxious about whether or not they're going to have a job tomorrow. There is no doubt that that does contribute to a sociological factor and the emotional and the pathological relationship between employee and employer. You are absolutely correct. And that is a space that we need to fix today, for sure.
Um, is
Did I?
there any reason why you guys think that um, this, I was going to say the concern with, but the reality of if we assume that what Scott Galloway and these guys are saying is right, do you think there's any reason, what do you think the reason why this is happening? That we have this focus on men, on the crisis that men are going through right now. Is it because not just not just the reasons for it, maybe, but also the perception of it. I mean, it sounds as though Alisha would say, well, maybe this emphasis on this as a men, what people are going through now as a men's crisis is a biased one itself. I don't know if that's what you're saying, Alisha. And that
So I wouldn't say it's biased, but I think there is definitely a sense that there's going to be a focus on men. There's always the expectation that the goals for women are always going to align with parenting and motherhood. And while men, it tends to be in that outside workspace and stuff.
Yeah.
Um, could you repeat the question again, though?
Well, I really didn't articulate it very well. It's not your fault, it's mine. I guess I'm wondering, so why the perception of this, and
Mhm.
why insofar as it is a real
Because I think
problem, why the
we're
problem?
all struggling, and I think it's
Yeah.
it's emblematic because I've seen it too as well. This focus on male loneliness, especially
Yeah.
politically speaking. I know both parties are talking about how to engage with these
Mm,
voters to try to get access to them and stuff.
yeah.
But I think it's our focus is on them because traditionally men are expected to be hitting these goals and they're not. And when they don't, I guess for people, they see it as like a wider like warning that something is wrong, which I don't think they're off. There is, everyone knows something is wrong.
Yeah.
I think we can all agree, political or not, something is wrong. People are not hopeful. They are anxious. Like I have to read that Anxious Generation book because
Mm.
I definitely agree. And I probably would have great conversations with my mom about like there seems to be this sense of anxiety that since for even young as a kid before all of this that could be specific to me, but um it's very interesting. I think it's very indicative of the state of the world, the state of people, and it's emblematic of what is wrong. And I think that's what interests people in it.
So a couple of things there. I think one of the reasons why there's a focus on men, and that is females tend to be, strangely enough, they tend to be more resilient. Women will talk to each other. Women will communicate with each other. Men will not. They will not admit. They're not going to ask for directions. They will go 10,000 miles out of their way, 3 days out of their way, or wherever, and then
Yeah.
and then make their way back because I'm going to prove something that I know. I know what's best.
Yeah.
So then when you look at the statistics, yes, they've got a higher propensity for suicide. They have a high propensity for substance abuse. They have a higher propensity for destruction towards others, hurting others, and everything else. Okay, if they don't feel like what they're doing. Now, again, from a female's perspective, you may want to say, well, what's that got to do with me? Well, it's got to do with you because you live in that society. Okay. Now, should you be the one fixing it? No, I don't think that you're supposed to be the one fixing it. It's not females who are supposed to fix it. I think that's one of the things that Scott Galloway and certainly David Brooks talk about, that this is a man's problem. This is the men having to fix the men. Okay, they're not looking at the female. Okay, now I will go. I truly believe this, and I've had a conversation with a mentee of mine, and he said that in the school systems, girls are taught to stay away from boys. Boys are taught to stay away from girls. Boys, I remember, being 11 years old or 10 years old playing kiss chase.
Yeah.
With kids, where you would run around, chase a girl, and grab her and kiss her. I
Yeah.
mean, my God, you would be taken out of school.
Yes.
I
Yeah.
mean,
Yeah.
and thrown out today. That's insane to
Yeah.
me.
Yeah.
Oh, what? We need to protect these 8-year-old girls from these 8-year-old
Well,
boys.
I would argue I have not had that experience. I give
Well,
or
but
take, I'm homeschooled, so I didn't have the latter half of my schooling and stuff. But boys definitely had bothered me, and there was not protection for me in any sense.
well,
I would be forced to hold hands with boys. They would follow me around and harass me. And there wasn't anything that I did. It was just because they liked me that there's this sense that they were allowed to do that. And the people around didn't seem to see it as a problem.
They
So,
wouldn't address it
from
if you
lived
said that it was
experience,
a problem.
I
I'm
wouldn't,
sorry.
as a child, you don't
Yeah.
even realize that it is. I'm just feeling a certain way. And I know other people
Mm.
sometimes, well, no, I don't even think teachers rarely caught it, but it isn't, I don't think that is the lived reality for maybe for very young, like Gen
well,
Alpha. But from my experience, boys were allowed to do those things and it was minimized,
right.
the effects. Like I remember sitting in kindergarten on the lap of a teacher because I had to be taken away from another boy because he kept bothering me.
Yeah. And again, I'm not, my whole point is not to bring back a game that was popular in the 70s and bring it back to today because it clearly wouldn't work. The point though is the point I think what we're trying to figure out, I think what they're trying to figure out is then then how do we, when do we, when do we think it's okay? At what age? Is it 1 years old, 2 years old, 3 years old? What
I
age is
think
it?
it takes
Well,
communication, talking about,
well,
because children don't have access to education on consent and bodily
but
autonomy and all of these things that they should be able to advocate for, which I've seen speaking with my mother and how she's been speaking with other parents and stuff, that is something that is becoming more common, talking about consent with children, about the fact that you have the ability to tell someone no when they want to try to touch you. um and that's not to say that there's times people want to like, that the kiss chase game, I could imagine I would love to play that game with my boyfriend. um but that's because I love my boyfriend. I think the problem is when this environment starts taking in other people and they are not consenting to whether or not this is a game, then it becomes this horrible thing that no one wants. The
well,
reality is no one wants.
yeah. And I think unfortunately, Alicia, I think the problem is that when we take out the environment to experiment, when we take out the environment to be creative, when we take the environment for we as humans, just pure humans, to interact with each other and not having to have a referee everywhere we go. Okay. Not saying that teachers don't have an obligation. That is not what I'm saying. Teachers clearly do at all levels, and so do employers. Employers have an obligation too. But the question, though, is I think this is where a lot of this is landing, and that is, when I talk to my mentee, and he's telling me that girls are being taught this way, and so when every time a boy walks up to a girl and wants to ask her out on a date, and she says, "What are you doing hitting on me?" And every time it's not just being pleasant towards that individual, and maybe you are, but that is not what they see on a regular basis. So, what does that tell them? You know what? It's not being valued, the fact that I'm even walking up. Whereas, again, going back many decades, there was a value that even the woman would tell their daughters, hey, even if you don't want to go out with this guy, then at least give them the consideration. Hey, thanks for asking me out, but I prefer not to, or I have. But today's environment is you don't have to be that pleasant. And that's the point. I mean, we can talk
I
about.
think that's false. This is a reaction to the very real violence and lived experience. Like I get very angry when I get hit on. This is because as a child, as a God, how young would I have been? 12, 13. Since that age, I've been harassed by old men, young men, boys of my own age. It doesn't matter. Um, so when a man tries to talk to me, my reaction is indignance, is anger. There's a guy once who he wasn't complimenting. He was talking about my jeans. They're super ripped jeans, and I assumed I'm sitting in the car. David's outside of the car getting gas. This guy comes over and mentions my pants, and I'm about to like fight with this guy because I'm like, there is in no way that you have the right to make me feel this sense of fear in my own body. And this is a reaction to the lived experience. And like, I get it, I understand. Maybe he just thought they were a cool pair of pants or something. But this is the reality that a lot of people live in, and that is why they react the way that they do. It is from pain, it is from trauma.
And you
Yeah.
think more, so I'm sorry, let me just ask you, and you think most girls have gone through this, which is why they're
Yes.
reacting. Okay, okay.
And I think there is still spaces where it just does need to be worked out where men and women can interact, and it doesn't feel like that constant sense of wherever I'm at, I'm going to be picked out by a man and he decides whether or not he likes me, and it's going to become my problem whether or not I care or not. Um,
Why is it your problem? And I'm not saying that as a challenge. I
because
was just wondering what made it your problem. You couldn't tell the guy walked up to you in
because
school. You couldn't say screw you, leave me alone. I mean, or and if he
that's
kept
not how it
bothering you,
usually
couldn't go to a
goes.
teacher
It's
and say,
usually a lot of times it's usually I'm just walking and I get cat calls or I get beeped at. There is no
"Hmm,
interaction for you to be able to continue
hmm,
to like speak or interact. And it's like that causes a fear response.
yeah,
Um, I think if people had ways of, and this is going back to like community and finding ways to connect with other people, like you said, in workplaces, being around people and being able to interact with them is important. I agree with you. Um, but a lot of people have been hurt. And I think ignoring that pain is what will end up perpetuating it. That is my fear, which
yeah.
I completely understand. Yes, people are more closed off and it'd be nice for them to be more connected, but it is a reaction to the reality that a lot of people live in.
So so based on what you're saying, how would you as if you were a mother and you had a son, or whether you've got a nephew, how would you encourage a young man who sees a girl either at school, at college, or at work, or out in the community? How would you try to get, how would you encourage them, if you would
I would
encourage them?
start a relationship with that person. For
But
me,
how? But
the
how do you start? How? By you're approaching them, and what should they
yes, but that
say?
approach doesn't have to be centered on what you're attracted to for that person. It's for
Isn't
me,
that what people usually say? I mean, like,
I'm a very cerebral person, so this is very confusing for me. When I start a conversation or relationship with someone, it isn't about what there's no desire for me uh of what I want in that situation. It's just trying to get to know the person. I liked the dating apps because I was able to kind of go through and I saw little bits of personality in people, and then we would talk. And depending on how that talk, and a lot of times it's just not being creepy. Like I have friends on dating apps, and the way that men engage with women is disgusting in a lot of ways. I'm sure it goes both ways. I think people are really bad over technology, but there's there's a difference between going up to someone and being like, "Hey, what kind of book are you reading?" and like engaging with them, having actual interest, checking out whether or not, hey, are they genuinely engaged? Or are they just, trying to appease you and get you to leave them alone? It's like it doesn't have to be this do or die whatever you do in this situation. I think it's genuinely trying to connect with the person.
And I think that's what, and again, when you see somebody out in the community or at work or whatever, there's 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 an attraction. You may not know them, you don't know their interior, you've not worked with them, you've just seen them. So there's a physical attraction. That's part of life, that we're physically attracted to people. How do they know what books you read? I mean, if they say, "Hey, those earrings look nice on you," is that being creepy? Saying,
No, depending on how you engage. If someone was engaging with you, they're like, "Oh my God, I love your earrings," or "Wow, those are really pretty earrings." I may start talking about my jewelry and how I make jewelry, and from there, how that conversation goes. If it's going to go completely towards a sexual nature, which a lot of times that's where it goes, I have no interest in that, and I think a lot of people don't have interest in that.
I get what you're saying and I guess I get, and I'm trying to think of what Galloway and how he would respond to some of these things, and I think my visceral sort of reaction and Herb's may have a lot to do with, you might think, and it might be true, with the fact that we are men. First of all, we're men and we're older. We come from a generation where we didn't really worry all that much about how, I mean, you expected there to be awkward exchanges, or maybe somebody would even get offended. And then you were expected to just work that out. Whereas this is one thing I think is different now, and I'm not saying it's better or worse, but there's this hyper concern bordering on paranoia with, "Oh my God, my kid's feelings might get hurt because of this awkward interaction." And we want to protect them from it. And I think that's where a lot of these highly super micromanaged environments that we
But
have
I would like to say
where they don't take risks emerge from that. Am I wrong, Herb? I mean, because
in a
I'm
media
presuming to speak for Herb, and I don't know if I should, but yeah,
environment where we're watching things like the Epstein files, where children were systemically assaulted,
yeah,
they were trafficked, and
yeah,
we are seeing no repercussions.
yeah.
We live in a society where that is normalized. And I think that is why
That's
people
I think
are
we heard you on
borderline
that. Yeah.
paranoid
Okay. No,
because
that's
Yeah.
okay.
And
Alicia,
Yeah,
Yeah,
go
yeah,
ahead.
that's where I would say
Yeah,
no. I think that's
yeah,
a little that's false. It's not normalized, which is one of the reasons why it's being brought up. If it was normalized, nobody would be talking about it. It's not normalized, and I think so many now. Are there repercussions? No, there aren't. We're not seeing any here. Abroad, you're seeing more. I understand what you're saying. Again,
yeah,
the
yeah,
question, though, I think what's really comes out of this, and I think this is part of that social media thing, and that is, are we heightening more than now? Listen, your lifestyle and what you're sharing, okay, may be, um, hey, I don't want to say that it was. I hope it's not the average of every girl that was being raised.
Unfortunately, it
Well,
is common
okay,
for women.
okay, okay. Well then, I'm going to go. If that is true, okay, okay, Alicia, and I'm going to give that to you. If that is true, then I understand then why boys, young men, and men don't approach girls. Then that's exactly it. Um, then that is exactly it because I do have conversations with young men who feel like, no, I get thrown under the bus. There's no point me even doing it. And so whomever did that to you, okay, and to all the other girls, what they're taking that is they're project and I'm not saying that in a wrong way. I am not saying that in a bad way. But all I'm saying is then if that's what you're feeling and you're concerned about somebody walking up to you, okay, then that's one of the reasons why they're not doing it. And that's why they feel more comfortable. And girls are going to find that out, and women are starting to find it out that men are going to find it more comfortable sitting in their bedrooms watching videos and watching porn, okay, than interacting with a human who they don't because they just cannot feel comfortable enough that has their emotional as well as somebody ought to have the female's emotion. If the boy, let's call the boy's kind of a nerdy kind of guy, and he's not trying to do anything sexual to the girl, just wants to make friends and try to communicate. It might be a little bit awkward or whatever. Well, if that woman or if that girl shuts him down, okay, he may not get up again. And that's what's coming out of. Now again, I am not, let me just say one more time, just so that we all know. It's not that it's the woman's fault. That is not this. The fault is certainly some historic problems of the male. No doubt about that. How to treat a female, how to approach a female. There's all that. Is there some, and David Brooks talked a little bit about it, there is some responsibility of the female recognizing how much effort, how much adrenaline you've got to have pent up as a boy to walk up to a girl knowing she's probably going to say no to you. I mean, even selling a vacuum cleaner at a house, that takes a lot of courage and a lot of effort. When you start putting your emotions into it, it's even greater. But I am not discounting anything that you're saying. And if you clearly went through a lot of that, I truly understand. I truly understand why you wouldn't want to interact with boys or men or I get
But
it.
I also think that there isn't just a no interact. Like if that was the case, I wouldn't have met my boyfriend. It did create a sense of me and other men and like a separation for a long time before I started to engage. I trusted myself enough to try dating. And there's trust that comes with that, engaging with people, dealing with the awkwardness and stuff. And I do understand that in that sense.
yeah, yeah. I get what you're saying. I get what both of you are saying. I guess, and we're probably winding down in terms of time, but I was just thinking, this whole conversation is brought up and listening to those interviews, brought up, um, for me, incidents when I grew up and I got bullied. I got beat up sometimes. I got in fights because of it, and I got beat up again. And I got and I was at times I was degraded. At times I said things to other people, not women necessarily, girls, but just things that I shouldn't have. I was cruel in ways I shouldn't be, and then I was forced to pay the consequences, socially, if not administratively. But I I gotta say, I think having and being permitted to have those awkward and sometimes traumatizing situations occur in my life when I was a child, were formative experiences that, you know, and I hate to use that expression, made me a man, but matured me, that made me, that I learned from. And I just sense that if I was in an environment, you know, all of those things are things that now would absolutely be excised from, have been excised from schools, right? And no bullying, no hurting people's feelings, no saying anything offensive that might be offensive in any way to anybody about any aspect of what they're, you know, of how they look or what they're doing. All of those things now, all of those experiences, you know how they were saying, imagine never having, take away all the interactions you ever had with your friends, all the times that you laughed with people. Well, take away all the times you were embarrassed, all the times you had awkward, you felt the victim of injustice, you felt humiliated and degraded, or were the perpetrator of that and had to live with that afterwards and learn why that was wrong by the way people responded to you. Imagine taking away all those things. And I think that is what Scott Galloway is worried about, because that's what we're starting to do at school and in the workplace. Am I wrong about that, Herb? That I think is what he's concerned with, because it's, you know, we desperately don't want kids to get ever traumatized or upset or scared or feel degraded or feel like they've been made an object. And I get that. I get that protectiveness. But I just wonder if you excise those experiences from people's young lives, if you're throwing out the baby with the bathwater, so to speak. Now, that's my final question to you
No,
guys.
I do completely agree with you in the sense that I don't know what the saying is like pain is growth, or like
Yeah,
feeling pain
yeah,
is sometimes important because it shows growth. Um, I don't disagree with that, but also understanding how like talking about bullying and stuff.
yeah,
Bullying has always been used I never understood bullying as a kid. Like I said, I've been in homeschool for half of my education, so I wasn't going to understand it. Um, but a lot of what I started understanding as I got older is that bullying a lot of times had to deal with things like class, race, gender, all of these
yeah,
performances and identities uh, that we try to keep people in line with, or the
mm,
way that we see
yeah,
people, the way that we categorize them.
mm,
Um, those are not good things.
yeah,
They are not. But then there's on the other side of it, there's jokes that I will have. I've heard it's like, you know, where people are too confident online that they can't get punched in the face.
mhm.
I don't agree with the violence, but I understand the sentiment. When people don't deal with a certain type of friction, they're not able to come to that realization. And I definitely understand where you're going with that, and I agree.
Yeah,
It isn't a zero sum game. It's
yeah,
throwing the baby out with the bathwater. I think there is somewhere in between where we can hold both of these things, um, growth and pain, without, you know, continuing to systemically discriminate and uh, contribute to the things that we already dislike.
that very well said, I think. Yeah,
Wow, wow. When we first started this, again, one of the great things about our conversations, we never know where they're going to end up. Um, we're not going to throw any babies out of any baths here. And we really appreciate Alisha being in the lion's den here
yeah,
with Rich and Herb, who were raised in the dark ages of malehood. But no, seriously, seriously, what great just just great conversation. What we did is we took what is out there in the world today as genuine importance, and somewhat even crisis, and we brought it here to this environment. And Alisha, just thank you so much for sharing so much of that exact environment that we would not have known about and we don't know about, and sharing that, because it makes our life richer, and we're able to speak better about it. So thank you so much. Again, Rich, again, terrific, wonderful information, and thank you all for being here. And if you want to listen to more of us three getting down and dirty with something current, or if you'd like to share an idea with us, give us a shout. But make sure you hit that button and subscribe. So everybody, have a really nice Friday, rest of your weekend. Keep it between the lines, and we'll see you next week. Ciao. Thanks for hanging out with us today. We look forward to next week as we cover another cool and fun topic. This podcast was produced by Three Lions Production and sponsored by Consulting and Training. Until next time, keep it between the lines.